Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of TNHP. I'm a huge fan of your channel and it's so wonderful to have you on, Adam.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
All right. Well, let's get right into it. So can you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and what sparked your interest in Greek history or history in general?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in England, raised in Canada. I really got into ancient Greece when I was around 6 or 7 years old. I think most people at that age get into ancient Greece because of the mythology aspect, whereas I was not at all interested in the mythology. I was very much like I like the history thing. And that probably originates from my mum running a course that I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Horrible Histories TV show. It's like an old British sort of comedy show to teach history to kids. We ran like a course where we made our own show. And I really, really fell in love with the ancient Greek period. So then it sort of escalated rapidly out of control. And I ended up getting into ancient Greek living history and reenactment. Found an absolutely awesome group, and we've been growing and traveling around and doing events ever since.
That's awesome. Is your family big into history as well?
Um, Definitely not as much as me, although I have actually wrote my dad along into the whole reenactment world now. So he's also a member of our group and contributes a lot. So that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So, Greek history, kind of from a very young age, you were more interested in the actual historical aspects rather than the mythological aspects. How did you sort of find this reenacting group, or what got you into reenacting?
Well, I actually reached out to a guy who unfortunately recently just passed away, bless him, called Ash, and he was a member of the Hoplite Association in the UK, and he made me my first like linothorax tube and yoke style armor, and he let me know of this international event at Plataea that was going to take place in 2020 and then got cancelled because of the whole kerfuffle. So they got moved back to 2022, and that was my first sort of big event. I'd done like a few other small events with I tagged along to a more local Roman group. But basically, me and my dad flew down to Greece. There was a week-long event actually at the battlefield of Plataea, which was awesome. And I got to meet many people who I'd seen the little Facebook icon of for many years on the International Hot Plate Discussion group. And that's basically where I met the Americans who were starting their group. And basically, there's not really an ancient Greek reenactment group in Canada, unfortunately. So the Greek Phalanx, which is our group, is the only Greek living history group in the whole of the North American region. And that's been basically our main go-to. So we have people from like us in Ontario, Canada. We've got people from Florida, even California, New York, Virginia, Ohio. Really, really just cross-continental sort of group. And we have now peaked to over 35 members, I think, showed up to our biggest event this year. So that was really awesome.
That's great to hear. That's really wonderful. Yeah, the Greek Phalanx is a great group. I've reached out to them and they've been very helpful. I know you're a part of that as well, even though you're a little bit north of us here. Uh, but that's a wonderful thing to see that group growing, and hopefully this year you'll see a couple more. I can guarantee you'll see at least 36 this year.
That's excellent. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like every event now, I'm like, I don't know who half these people are. I'm like, who the heck are you showing up now? Yeah, no, it's awesome. Really great to see that many enthusiastic people.
Yeah, of course, especially with the ancient history. There's a lot of early American history reenactments in the United States.
Yeah, you guys have too many Civil War reenactors, not enough ancient reenactors.
I would have to agree with that. Now, I have two more questions for you before we start talking about today's topic, which is the hoplite and everything related to hoplite history. What other sorts of history subjects or eras are you really interested in? Is it mainly just Greece, or you mentioned Rome in there?
It's basically just Greece, although I've actually started to get into sort of Agincourt periods English history, and just recently joined up with a medieval group, the company The Black Spear, and I'm piecing together an impression. Now, I actually have ancestry like linked back to a Scottish lord called Blair of Balthaoch, so I'm basically trying to recreate an ancestor of mine, which I obviously can't do with the Greek stuff. But otherwise, it's basically always just been ancient Greece.
That's very interesting. Court of Agincourt, that's French, Renaissance era, correct?
It would be around 14, 15, so the Battle of Agincourt sort of period group.
That's interesting. And you have a relative from that era.
Yes, so I am literally the most sort of British person you could ever possibly imagine. It's like I'm English, I have Scottish family, Irish ancestry, everything like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so this specific guy, our family, distant family, recently, up until recently, still actually owned the what was left of the castle. But yeah, so Blair of Balthaoch, he was a somewhat prevalent Scottish lord of some period, and we have his crest and his heraldry and his signet ring and stuff like that. So that was like that's kind of cool to link back to an actual ancestral tie.
Yeah, that's extremely neat. I love, whenever you can trace your ancestry back to something like that and just you're able to see, it puts a little bit of humanity into it as well.
Hmm.
Now, before we go into this subject, I have one more question for you about your personal life. What ignited your desire to create a YouTube channel? Because you run the YouTube channel Leonidas Sparta and you do all sorts of content creations related to Greek history and Greek arms and armor. What made you decide that you wanted to create that channel?
So I started that channel when I was 12, and I absolutely hate those videos that I originally released, but I keep them there as a reminder to see where I came from.
Yeah.
And it basically came from 12-year-old me being interested in ancient Greek history, seeing all of these other YouTubers like Scholar Gladiatoria, Scalagram, and Metatron all covered medieval stuff, and I was like, where's the ancient Greek coverage on YouTube? So 12-year-old me thought, I'll do it. And I spouted a load of nonsense and was terribly inaccurate. And then it eventually sort of became something that has sort of filled that space now, I feel like, on YouTube, which feels surreal for me. We just broke 50,000 subscribers this month, which was crazy. I never thought when I started this channel it would actually get that big. And it is a really sort of surreal experience when there's people that have found our reenactment group through the channel, or they're like, you've inspired me to join into ancient Greek historical study, or you've helped me write my university thesis. And I'm like, it's sort of been this weird spiraling thing of like young me, especially I love it when I get the younger people who are in the early teens who reach out and say like, I love the history that you talk about on the channel. And it's sort of just become, yeah, like this really heartfelt thing that I really love doing now, and sort of being able to add a cool lens to ancient Greek history that's sort of previously been lacking the online sort of world.
Yeah, I agree. That's actually, you mentioned, people have found the reenactment groups and other things through your channel. And that's actually one of the ways that I, discovered this was an organization because I know about the BAR, which is Brigade of the American Revolution. I know there's plenty of Civil War reenactors, but I wasn't really sure about, the sort of ancient historical reenactments. And I actually found out about that through your channel. And I love what you do there. It's lots of great information. And yeah, there was kind of a gap there. The only person that I think who might have had a little bit of some of the history and topics that you touch on is Lindy Beige. I used to watch him a lot. And yeah, Scholagram, I used to watch him all the time, especially with like all the sword tests and stuff,
Hmm.
as a 15-year-old kid, like there's nothing better than that. It's just so cool. Um, Even now as an adult, nothing better than that. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that there was kind of a little bit of a gap there. Plenty of medieval stuff on there, which is wonderful, but really awesome to see something in ancient Greece.
Well, thank you. And I'm really happy that you found the group from that. Again, I love like interacting with little comment icons is great, but like when you actually get to talk to people in person, it makes it so much more real, and I love that.
Yeah, of course. And I appreciate you, taking the time to talk through all the little intricacies and, leave comments and talk back and forth. I think that, that's really one of the ways that we learn a lot together is, having that dialogue, especially when you're trying to research things that are quite obscure, which is a lot of what it seems that you do.
Yeah, it's a very niche sort of topic that, and it's also a topic when it comes to, which I'm sure we'll cover later, sort of what is that experimental archaeology sort of topic, is lots of the stuff that we do a lot of research in isn't necessarily the type of stuff that like actual academic scholars would do a lot of research into. They aren't necessarily looking at all of the intricacies and styles and evolutions and things of armor and clothing and shoes. Like there's a shoe debate going on in the recreational world. No historian's really interested in shoes, right? So there's things like that that is a different lens that sort of when you can get that scholarly and practical collaboration is a really, really strong force when it comes to sort of tackling these sort of complicated historical topics.
Yes, I agree. And I think that when you actually get a chance to, like you mentioned, we'll touch on later, the uh, history, the actual interactive history, or, trying to live history through practical applications, you kind of see what works and what doesn't. And then also you start to understand maybe why they did things the way that they did. And that's like super cool just to, you know, put on the garments and see how it feels and, get an understanding of what life was like. And I think that's a very important part of history as opposed to the scholarly side. But we'll touch on that later. But for now, let's get into the main point of our discussion today, which is the hoplite. And the hoplite, I actually have my shirt on, a hoplite shirt. I don't know if you can
Look
see
at
that.
that. Dress for the occasion.
It is, I believe it's kind of modeled after an archaic hoplite a little bit, the with a little bit of a transitional muscle cuirass there.
Oh yeah, and he's got the J crest as well, I think.
Yes, and
Thigh
and
armor.
thigh armor as well. All right. So, the hoplite. So there's no stupid questions here. Let's start with the most basic concept. What is a hoplite?
That's a great question. So hoplite derives from the term hopla, which means equipment or arms, armament. It essentially, like just literally translated, means man who is equipped, is essentially what it means. Now, there's a misconception going around that it comes from the term hoplon, which is sometimes sort of incorrectly referred to as the hoplite shield. This isn't quite correct. So we get the term aspis for the specific hoplite shield well before the term hoplon appears, and we get hoplites wielding aspides showing up in the sources as well. So hoplon seems to be a later term that can be sort of used to mean shields. Like you could describe a pelter as a hoplon. So an aspis is a hoplon sort of in the sense that the aspis is a shield, but specifically hoplite derives from just the term equipment. And it's essentially the heavy infantry footmen of the ancient Greek world. We sort of typically today refer to them as strictly Hellenic forces, but to the ancient Greeks, sort of anyone who was an armored foot soldier could be described as a hoplite. These were typically citizen militia forces, so there are essentially no professional forces at all in our period that we look at. Every male citizen, depending slightly on the city state, from roughly the age of 18 to 60, was eligible to serve military duties, basically to maintain your citizenship. And these were typically your middle to aristocratic class. We start to see that get a little bit broken down as we see mass conflicts emerging. But otherwise, these were people who could afford these rather expensive weapons and equipment. And it was sort of landowners fighting landowners for land was most of these battles. So essentially, a citizen militia force who fought with a spear and shield predominantly, some form of armor, and they were the main sort of backbone of these ancient armies.
So you mentioned that hoplite comes basically from the word meaning equipment or equipped man. There's another word that oftentimes comes up when you're talking about armor and things like that. The word is panoply, if I pronounce that
Yes,
correctly.
yeah.
What does that word mean?
I believe it literally just means collection, but we typically, the same way that you would say a medieval harness, we would just typically refer to as the hoplite's panoply. So essentially, the hoplite's armor collection, I guess, would be what it literally translates as. But yeah, essentially, the suit of armor, the weaponry, the armament is sort of referred to as the panoply in a Hellenic context.
I see. So these were not full-time trained soldiers in the sense that we have a modern military where you join the military and you serve for a duration of period. It's essentially any man from 18, I believe you said 18 to 60 can is obligated to serve in times of war. So were all of these hoplites Greek citizens? Do we have any sort of records of mercenaries or possibly even uh, helots, I believe, which is the term for slaves in Sparta, serving as
Yes.
hoplites?
Yes. So typically we are talking about Hellenic citizens. But we do also see mercenaries being contracted in from other places. Again, typically other Hellenic states, but not always. We see, for instance, the Scythians getting sort of coming in as and offering their sort of take to warfare, often fighting for different Greek armies. We also see certain lower class peoples, especially when we get to the Peloponnesian War. General Brasidas of Sparta famously fought and freed 700 helots. So your sort of Spartan slave servant class, depends sort of what period we're talking about, ever debated topic, equipped them as infantry and freed them for their noble fighting, essentially. So we do see, typically in times of mass conflict, we see this sort of government equipment of lower class citizens to fight as bare bones infantry. But otherwise, typically these are Greek citizens, somewhat aristocratic citizens. But we do have a few exceptions there as well.
I see that's interesting. And also possibly gaining freedom is something that would have, caused people to want to participate in the conflict or become a soldier, I assume. Some sort of incentive to serve in the Greek military.
Yeah, definitely something. The whole treatment of the Helots is such a complex topic, and it seems to change so dramatically through the period. Um, and even Plutarch sort of talks about this, that he marks basically there was a great earthquake in 426, I want to say, BC, that sparked loads of Helot uprisings. And he says that basically he believes that that is when the treatment of the Helots went dramatically more intense than what it used to be. But yeah, so we sort of see this weird relationship between the Spartans and the Helots. It's like, in one sense, they seem to rebel, in the other sense, they're arming them to fight with them. So it's like, how does this dynamic work if you're essentially arming people who are trying to rebel? Very, very complex topic that would probably require a whole separate episode to really talk about. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that I would love to definitely talk more about in the future. So if we could, get that episode together, I'd definitely be interested in that. But that does bring me to my next question. So you're talking about the evolution of kind of how helots or slaves might have been treated throughout Greek history. So what era did hoplites exist in? Because this is rather a long period of time, correct? So we're talking possibly before the archaic period all the way up through what we now think of the hoplite in the Hellenic or Alexandrian period, I guess you could say. And could you provide some sort of context to, maybe events that were happening in these different eras?
Yes, so there's not really a strict start and cutoff date necessarily to when we sort of think of the hoplite soldier as emerging. Typically, it's the 8th century BC is when we start to say the hoplite really emerges. Um, yeah, so around in the 700s, I guess you could say. Really, they get the most iconic form in the 6th century, coming into the 5th century BC. That is really when we start to see the turn to phalanx warfare. So earlier on, we don't necessarily see strict shield wall sort of blockades. We have Tartaeus mentions hoplites fighting side by side with the naked men. So basically, a not very structured. We don't entirely know how this formation would have worked, but essentially, hoplites with throwing spears, hoplites side to side with peltasts, and then around the very broad and blurry transitional period we start to see, which is sort of the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century, sort of the Greco-Persian Wars is sort of in the heart of that transitional period. We see the separation of infantry from light troops, and we start to see formations get more tightly packed. Then, as you get into the 400s, the time of the Peloponnesian War, again, we see combat start to change. Um, you're in far more mass conflicts, mass states of war than you typically were in the archaic period. So, whereas your typical archaic conflict might be, a 3-day march, you're going over the hilltop to neighboring polis to fight for some farmland, you pack for a long weekend. The times we're in mass conflict, you talk about campaigns that could last months. So warfare starts to change. Warfare seems to get more tightly packed. as we get into the 400s and the 300s. And when does hoplite warfare really end? It's really considered when the Spartans adopt the Macedonian pike phalanx in, I forget the exact date, but in the 300s, I believe. So we sort of see this again, sort of blurry. What do you classify as a hoplite? What do you classify as a phalanx? All these types of things. But yeah, it typically goes from sort of after the geometric period through the archaic into the classical, and basically dies off around the Hellenistic period, to be very broad.
Yeah, so we're talking possibly a period of about 500 years,
Yeah,
500,
yeah,
600
probably
years.
about there. Yeah.
I see. And then before that, before the Archaic period, you have sort of the Mycenaean period, correct? And that's more of starting to bleed into the Bronze Age.
Yes, well, you technically have the geometric period, which is otherwise known as the Greek Dark Age, after the Bronze Age collapse, separating the two. But yes, otherwise you have the Bronze Age. The time of the Trojan War, for example, is said to have been in the sort of Mycenaean Bronze Age, which sees very, very interesting and different styles of armament and warfare. Homer describes basically nobles as using chariots as like taxi services and basically driving around the battle, hopping off, fighting. You see them in these great big dendra panoplies, which are really crude but also really advanced for the time period that we're talking about. That's essentially full bronze plate. And otherwise, we have a few artistic depictions, but otherwise, no massively concrete sources. You don't have a Thucydides of the Bronze Age, really. Homer is our biggest source for detailing how these Bronze Age warriors fought.
Yeah, and I mean we're talking over 3,000 years ago, so we're definitely gonna, records are going to be a little more scarce at that time. But yes, some of the armor at that point, I won't spend too much time on it, but the Dendra, Panoply, and some of the other armors from that period are quite amazing and have some sort of lamellar scale armor as well that I've noticed on some of the recreations, which I think is very neat because I typically have seen that associated with Eastern nations and factions and the like.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting to see the armors. It's a period where like I would love to do it at some point, like recreate it, but it's like it would be so expensive to do, and there's not really a group for it, so a little bit more difficult.
100%. And now on the front end, just to set the stage, when the hoplite era sort of ends, we're talking close to the time of Alexander, correct? Or a little bit
Yeah, yeah,
after?
pretty close. We basically see the Macedonian pike phalanx get widely adopted across all Hellenic states, so either by conquest from Macedon or just adaptation to this new style of war. Yeah.
I see. And then right around that same time, the Roman Republic, not empire, but starts to emerge in I believe, the fourth century BC or a little bit before that, but it starts to grow during that time.
Yeah, it's again quite blurry how we try and cut off date this. Now, once we get into the 300 BCs, my knowledge base is not nearly as big. So my main focus is 6th century through to the Persian War. So it's quite an isolated but very complex period of time. So any of sort of after the Battle of Leucatra in 371, not as grounded in that period.
Of course, and there's even more changes that subsequently will happen in those coming periods. So that's great. Try to stay within those lines to understand the hoplite, the hoplite and sort of the weapons and armor and how life was. So we've talked a little bit about what the hoplite is, who they may have been. Now I want to take a second and go through head to toe what the hoplite was wearing, what they may have looked like, and then maybe a little bit of what their life was like. So, can you walk me through the armament or panoply and style of a hoplite at the earlier time? So, like during the archaic period, what would a hoplite have worn? Their clothes, their sandals? Did they have different types of armor? Um, did they wear any sort of armors that didn't really exist later during the Persian Wars, and how did that kind of evolve over time?
Yeah, so the arcade period is my main focus actually. So that's a great question to ask. My main panoply, which you can just sort of see hanging in the background there, at least part of him, is around a 550 BC, specifically Laconian figurine that I recreated. And we see, in my opinion, the coolest armament in all of history in this period. It's basically, now again, I guess I'll outline this with there's no uniformity in this period. So it fully escalates based on the status and wealth of the individual, the personal preferences of the individual, so much so that it depends on that. So I guess I'll start with a broad overview of the most aristocratic, which is my favorite, which does see essentially full plate coverage. So we have sabatons in this period, foot armor that is anatomically correct. So it's like a hinged toed actual foot that you would wear. We sometimes see ankle guards. We see greaves, which is the which is the shin armor. We see even thigh armor being worn. We see typically in the archaic period what's sort of referred to as a bell cuirass. So it's this very hourglass sort of shaped. It comes in and then juts out into this waist, which is why it's called a bell cuirass, which is full bronze, very, very good protection. And we see a variety of different helmets. So the Corinthian's the most iconic hot plate helmet, basically even until it stops being used. But it's not the only hot plate helmet. So you can see examples of a Corinthian there and a Corinthian there. This is an earlier style. That's a slightly later style. We would also see helmets like the Illyrian helmet being used, which is doesn't necessarily mean it originates from Illyria. It's a modern name that was given to it because either the first or a load of helmets have been found in that region. Seems to have actually originated in the Peloponnese around Argos or Corinth. And that shows a very, again, very, very well protected helmet, but it has this sort of whole face opened. You'd see some Chalcidian helmets coming in. There's a lot of different styles of helmets that you could wear. And we also see, which is really, really awesome, the existence of upper and lower arm armor also being used in this period. So again, this would have been the minority of hoplites. Most people would not have been equipped in that level of armor, and that would have been really, really aristocratic. We start to also see the existence of sort of what's been coined the transitional cuirass. So the shift in style from the bell cuirass, which isn't very anatomically correct, a lot more stylized, into the more anatomically correct muscle cuirass. So my cuirass over here, you can see is essentially a bell cuirass. It starts to have the abs and musculature added in, and this flared waist is a lot less dramatic. Um, we see and then drop those pieces of armor as you escalate down the social ladder, essentially. We also sort of start to see around the 6th century the adoption of the very famous linothorax or tube and yoke style armor. Again, don't know how it was made. Likely loads of different construction methods were used to create this. In fact, the most famous and well preserved one of these is actually iron, and that's Phillips of Macedon. So it's possible that some of these could have possibly even had a metal core for all we know. Otherwise, leathers, linens, various different types of linens could be used. That also seems to spark off in this period. And you start to see an overall evolution towards more anatomically correct armors in this period. So greaves go from sort of being more plain or highly decorated. Sometimes you have like embossed gorgon heads or snakes or anything like that. And they seem to shift into something that is more anatomically correct, but still stylized, but more anatomically correct. In this style of warfare, it's also very, very interesting because they're not fighting in tight phalanxes. So we actually see in depictions, the Che Guevara shows this really, really well, hoplites carrying two throwing spears into battle. So the very famous hoplite dory, which is roughly 7 to 9 feet in length, double-ended, tapered. This spear isn't really used early on. It seems to be adopted in the 6th century. We see um, as I said, the existence of two throwing spears, and they feature something called an ankyle, which is essentially a throwing loop. And this can increase range of a throw by up to 40%, which is quite considerate when you think of it like that. And it seems to be that this style of warfare, as I said earlier, you're intermingled with the light troops, the peltasts, the naked men. You're throwing javelins. You're sort of skirmishing. Sort of think of it as a mix between Homeric heroic dueling and tight classical phalanx warfare. Uh, Very, very complex and a lot of nothing really concrete to say about it. But it seems to be a looser structured style of warfare, more of a warband style of warfare. And this likely is one of the reasons why we see the existence of this fully armored hoplite, which Keep in mind that this fully harnessed or fully equipped armament doesn't really reappear until the medieval period. We often labeled like
Yeah.
the 14th century is the birth of plate. Well, that actually isn't correct. We see full plate armors in the 6th century BC, which is one of the reasons why I really like it. And this whole sort of setup is likely, we can't necessarily say for certain, but likely due to the style of warfare. So, of course, armor, and it's why we see armament and weapons change throughout all historical periods, is armor is fundamentally designed to protect you from the battlefield that you're fighting on. So if you're slightly more open, you're throwing spears, there's splintering spear shafts and sling stones, all this stuff bouncing around, then you might want to be more armored than when you're literally shoulder to shoulder compressed in a shield war. You don't necessarily need to be as armored. There's also the sense that these campaigns are typically shorter. So it's a lot easier for me to transport mass amounts of armor if I'm only going across the mountaintop. And you wouldn't really be wearing some for very long. You'd probably get dressed at fight and then immediately strip. So when we get into the sort of transitional period, we start to see this extra limb armor get dropped relatively quickly. There seems to be about a 70 to 90-year span that this stuff's used for. And the Persian Wars are around Thermopylae, around 480 BC. It's a really interesting period because most people think of that as a classical style of warfare. Again, these dates of archaic and classical are not necessarily strict cut-off dates, right? The same way that if you look at modern style changes from the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s, jeans, for example, you go from different cuts of jeans and there's a blurry transitional stage. Well, it's the same for armor. And this sort of period of the Greco-Persian Wars is really interesting because it is in the heart of this transitional period. So you still see some archaic styles of armament being used. In fact, I'd probably say more archaic armor being used in this period. But you start to see the adoption of newer styles. And, the phalanx seems to be more tightly packed. We go to the most enclosed style of Corinthian helmet, possibly because of the Persians. So if you're fighting a heavily missile-based army, then you might want a fully enclosed near enough helmet to protect you from arrows. You might want to bunch together more to protect each other more. And we see the dory is now being used at a full sort of double-ended spear. And it's a really interesting evolution until you get into the classical period where we seem to see the fully adopted sort of tight classical phalanx being used. And armor goes through shifts as well. Helmets, as I said, this is sort of an earlier Corinthian. This is one that's used. This the most famous is what we call the Hermione style, which seems to be adopted around 500 BC. And these helmets actually drop out of use, I think, far earlier than most people think. So um, around 450 BC is about the last hurrah of these Corinthian helmets. So that's before the Peloponnesian Wars. So many people think of the Spartans and the Athenians of the Peloponnesian Wars being equipped with, muscle cuirasses and Corinthian helmets. Not very likely, unfortunately, because it's a really epic image. But essentially, as that muscle cuirass is emerging, that Corinthian helmet is really falling out of use. So in the transitional period, we would have seen lots of cuirasses similar to this, or more of essentially a muscle cuirass just with these swirls. And around 480, 470 is when we start to see the full bronze muscle cuirass come into full swing, and we start to seemingly see the tube and yokes be far more represented, so likely more common. Helmets open up again once they go to this most closed style. So we start to see, again, the Corinthian basically drops out of use. You see Chalcidian helmets, which sometimes have hinged cheek plates or just more opened faces. You see the Illyrian helmet still being used. You see the Pylos helmet, which is literally a conical hat. It actually evolves from the Pylos felted hat. There we go. Perfect.
Got it right
Um,
here. Just got it. Pilos cap.
awesome. And we see the, Attic helmet. So we sort of see that really iconic hoplite image that many people think of Corinthian helmets and muscle cuirasses basically didn't exist, unfortunately. And as we get into the Peloponnesian Wars, we start to see, of course, the mass conscript of men. You're at a mass stage of conflict. You're on longer campaigns, which is likely a reason why we start to see these extra armor bits also be dropped off. It's just they're an annoyance to transport, maintain throughout longer campaign periods. You're also filling out, you're sort of watering down your aristocratic numbers with more, conscripted poor people to fight as well. And we start to see, yeah, basically into that 400s BC's the fully adopted tight classical phalanx of what most people think of when they think of a phalanx, as opposed to the archaic period is a little bit looser, a little bit more interesting for me, anyways. But you see that full armament, javelins being used by hoplites, things like that. And then, of course, eventually that whole sort of classical phalanx would morph over to the Macedonian pike phalanx as well.
I see. And you mentioned something very interesting there that we sort of think that plate armor kind of originated in the 14th century and also that, it came from a need because of the type of armor that, or the type of warfare that was going on at that time. With the plate armor, we see almost full coverage, like you said, in the archaic period, and that's reflective of the type of warfare that was happening during this period. Would you say that perhaps the archaic period warfare was similar to that of like early medieval warfare, where it was kind of smaller bands of armies fighting against each other in sort of shorter formations? Because I know that from the medieval or early medieval times that that was sort of the case. There wasn't as large, raised, organized armies like there was in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so you sort of mean around the Vendel Viking Age, that type of early medieval periods?
Yeah, yeah, where you have small bands fighting each other, not, sort of like hundreds and hundreds or thousands of people fighting like you had in the Roman army or even during the time of Alexander.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I would say probably some of the battles probably were quite transferable, and some of them were larger scale. Uh, and I think something that's interesting as well with the when you get into the Viking Age is even that's heavily debated, right? Did they use shield walls or did they not? Similar with the Archaic period. So I would say it's definitely more similar to that than like 15th century style of warfare. Yeah.
100%, yeah. And another interesting thing that you mentioned that I also think is very uh kind of cool, another cool link to the medieval period, as you mentioned that they had the elite were able to afford the bronze armor, were able to afford the helmets, the cuirasses, the leg armor, and everything. But the people who maybe didn't have as much money were in the lower classes. They tended to maybe only have a helmet or maybe a linothorax or some sort of, other armor that was cheaper that they could have made themselves. I think that is also somewhat similar to how it was in the medieval period, where the ones who were in full regalia of plated armor were the social elite versus, people who were of lower classes, much like the Greeks at this time, had to foot the bill for their own armor. So maybe they had a padded gambeson and some chainmail and a nasal helm. A little bit of a correlation there between
Yeah.
the two periods, I think is
Definitely.
interesting.
People often have this idea, and it basically stems from Rome, because Rome was the sort of first professional force. And that's when we say, like, hoplites weren't professional forces. Typically, you compare them to Rome, and no Hellenic force even comes close to the professionalism of Rome. So yeah, we basically had this idea of, this is a hoplite, this is a Roman, this is a knight, as opposed to there's a lot of variation in that. At regional styles, at personal preference, and a massive one was wealth. How much could you afford, or how much could you warrant spending on this? And we have to remember as well that in times of frequent war, people would probably be spending more money on armament. But maybe there's a time where your polis has sort of been isolated, you're not really interacting with other people, then you might have a generation of people who really haven't put that much focus towards military equipment.
Yeah, that would make sense. I would imagine that, from the early 500, from the early 6th century BC, you would probably have a lot of people who were, producing armor versus up until, the Peloponnesian War, there was probably a little bit of a lull because I don't believe there was as many major conflicts. I know that there was
Yeah,
some
after
conflicts.
the Persian invasion, there's a little bit more of a quiet spot, definitely compared to what came after it. The Peloponnesian War is sort of World War Greece, I guess you could sort of call it.
100%. And I wanted to ask you about a piece of equipment that is kind of, I would say, I don't want to say shrouded in mystery, but it's kind of weird because you see it in video games and TV and in movies, and we don't necessarily know exactly how it was worn or constructed, but we have an idea of like, the length at this time for the hoplites, and those are taruges. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
Which,
yeah, or I think technically now my Greek pronunciation is not great. I think you actually would say pter. I think there is essentially a vocalization of the P, but anyways, that's all nerd stuff.
yeah.
So yeah, so pteryges essentially means feathers is the actual translation, and these are the little sort of strips of leather or fabric that hang below an armor. So we know some of these seem to have been directly attached to the cuirass itself. Now I'll fully outline this on bronze cuirasses, not universal, barely ever depicted on bell cuirasses. But on tube and yoke style of armors, they seem to have been essentially built into the actual thorax. But we do see on, I would say, probably a majority of muscle cuirasses and the sort of later transitional cuirasses, these pteryges coming in. Some of them seem to have again been sort of stitched or riveted around the actual cuirass through some artistic depictions. I don't believe there are any archaeological finds that actually show holes around the rim, which is why it's a little bit intriguing, as you said. There's also, of course, the option that it could have been worn on a belt. I think that's pretty likely that some of these would have been worn as a form of belt. Maybe glued onto the armor, so that would be why we don't see archaeological remains of them. Or, likely, as with many of these things, there wasn't one method of attaching them. So these essentially act as lower abdomen protection. People have this idea that armor ends at the hip and that terigers come down to the thigh. But most armors, actually, to be practical, essentially have to end at the belly button, and that's to allow for that motion of your torso moving. So the terigers also, if you want to be able to sit down, have to end before a certain region, and it's essentially the end of the groin is where it comes down to. So these are a flexible piece of armor that offer decent protection for your lower abdomen and sort of groin area. And some of them are probably made of leather, some of them are probably made of linens. Um, and we sort of see an interesting adaptation of typically bronze cuirasses are only ever shown with one layer of terragaze, I believe, typically with a curved sort of shape. We see on earlier tube and yokes one layer of terragaze as well. I believe the famous sort of Stele in Delphi shows a one-piece tube and yoke that has just one layer of terragaze. And we start to see that evolve into two layers, so they sort of stagger like that. And then in the Hellenistic period, we have this really weird looking terragé style where it almost comes up and over the cuirass and is typically a lot longer. So interesting style of armor, again, literally just means feathers and was essentially a form of lower abdomen protection that was somehow worn in collaboration with a rigid torso.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sort of an extension of the armor for mobility and flexibility, because these people, not only were they, marching into battle on campaign and, want to be comfortable, but also for the sorts of movements that you'll be doing, very active sort of um, act active sort of warfare. And would
Yeah.
you tend to say that this armor is comfortable to wear, having worn it yourself a couple different styles? Is it comfortable? Is it flexible? Can you move and breathe easily in it?
I mean, they're no pajamas, but like, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I've done over 8 hour days straight in armor at events. That's like the fully armored configuration. And I mean, your back will ache a little bit at the end of the day, but the way that the armor actually sits on you, it's not like holding a weighted backpack. So the armor very ergonomically is sculpted to the anatomy of the body, and the, for instance, the bronze cuirass. And I think people often overestimate how heavy this stuff is. This front and back plate's only 10 pounds. It's just not that heavy.
Wow.
This helmet is 2 pounds. It's not very heavy, and that's something that's really
Yeah.
interesting when we look at Hellenic armors. And some of the people in our group have been lucky enough to actually hold the real stuff. This stuff's notoriously light, very, very close fitting. You can see just from how it's designed. And typically very thin as well. Like when I say this to some of the people that are involved in medieval stuff, I'm like, yeah, the cuirass is 1 millimeter to 1.2 millimeters. They're like, what? But it's
Yeah.
because, again, armor is designed for the style of warfare that it's facing. We're not facing 180-pound war bows. We're not facing two-handed pole hammers or knights on horseback delivering, car level impact force. We're dealing with spear poking and lighter weight bows, bronze arrowheads, smaller swords, things like that. So the armor reflects that, and an added bonus that it's quite light. Um, so it fits very comfortably. Of course, sometimes armor malfunctions, sometimes it slips, sometimes it gets uncomfortable, but nothing that you can't just sort of hoik and fix. And overall, most of the armor sits on parts of the body that aren't really interfered with. So, for instance, the shin, right? The shin itself is essentially a part of the body that doesn't move when you move, right? It's quite a bony, there's not a lot of muscle on it. So greaves I can wear all day and basically forget that I'm wearing them. You basically don't feel them at all. Same with the sabatons. You basically have no problem wearing sabatons unless they come loose and then they're a big problem. But otherwise, again, basically as long as there's no malfunction, no sort of notice at all. Helmets are the one that sort of is the most cumbersome. Not because of the weight really isn't that bad, but it's mainly because of the actual heat of them. So we have this idea, and lots of this is true when you look at later medieval armors, of armor is very, very hot. When you look at Hellenic stuff, through my experience, this isn't really the case. And it's because the metal sort of creates a heat sink with your body. So because it is directly, essentially metal on skin contact or metal on wall contact, your body sort of regulates heat. The metal sort of sucks the heat, dispels it, and you sort of you can still get hot, but you don't burn in it. It's not burning to the touch.
Yeah.
Whereas in later medieval armors, where you do have a little bit more in terms of undergarments, you really heat up and you can't really cool off once you're in that. All of that's true except for the helmet, and because the helmet is separate from the face, right? It's still very, very close fitting, but if you touch the helmet, it sort of does heat up and heat your face up. So out of all of the pieces of armor that are the most uncomfortable to wear for long periods, it is the helmet in my experience. But then there's lots of ways that you can go about this. Obviously, taking the helmet off. It's one of the easiest pieces of armor to take off. And we see being done in artwork a lot is that very iconic sort of Pericles style of wearing the helmet tipped up so the cheeks are up here. And that's a very, very practical and easy thing to do. You can even march with the helmet tipped up like that. And of course, not so enclosed styles like Pylos helmets or Chalcidian helmets, you just fold the cheek plates up or you just are wearing sort of a conical hat. But otherwise, yeah, the armor, it's really hard to explain because it's like sort of a feeling that you have to sort of experience. So you have this sort of pop culture idea that armor is a tin can, you sort of need a crane to lift you onto a horse type thing. That's not correct at all. But then that's sort of been overcorrected. The pendulum's gone the other way. That is, armor doesn't impact you at all. That's also not correct. You are heavier, you tire quicker, there are slight movements that like, I can't do like this, for example, because my cuirass comes like that. I can do like that. But it's sort of a constant arms race in itself of what can I protect versus what do I restrict mobility wise. And overall, the way that I would describe armor is it is a um it allows you to execute everything that you need to do in combat, but also protects you to the best way that it possibly can. That's sort of the ideal thing that you're trying to meet. For example, I get better mobility in my armor than I do like a well-fitted suit, modern suit, for
Wow.
example.
Wow. That's interesting because I know that when the Greeks were donning their armor, it was basically just their clothes, and then they put the bronze cuirass or the linothorax on top of that. But,
Hmm.
there isn't really much of a need for that extra layer or,
No, not at all.
because you have a
Yeah.
big shield as well.
That's one of the biggest components. And again, one of the other biggest things is it's just what are we facing on the battlefield? We're not dealing with mega powerful weapons that can crush us. We're dealing with, typically light spear poking. And something else people have to consider as well is that armor isn't necessarily there to stop you from getting hurt. It's there to stop you from getting killed, ideally. And it's also not the first line of defense either. So, broadly speaking, there are certain cases where someone might decide to take a hit in order to deliver a counter strike or whatever. But, the first line of defense is not getting hit, right? It's either avoiding the weapon or the enemy missing you. Your second is interception. with a shield. Your third and most sort of risky option is getting hit with the armor. And overall, tests have shown that the armor holds up very, very well. We've tested sections of bronze thorax. We've tested various tube and yoke construction theories. And basically, the bronze hold up very, very well. The most that we got through with fully powered spear stabs was about a millimeter, so not even enough to really get through the underclothing because it's not like perfectly touching. There's a little bit of breathing space because your lungs
Yeah,
have to expand and contract. It does rest on the waist. That's sort of actually where the weight sits. So I can lower my shoulders in the cuirass, and the cuirass will actually stay floating slightly. So my
oh wow,
shoulders basically don't take any of the weight.
that's good.
Yeah, it's a lot more comfortable. Think of it sort of like a modern backpacking, like hiking pack, where it sort of straps around
Oh
the waist, so that
wow,
all of the weight of it isn't hanging on the shoulders. It's strapped around your center of mass, so it's a lot ergonomically better for your body to carry it because it's in a an area that isn't really. It's not the most. You don't notice extra weight there, I guess is what I'll say as much. It's
yeah.
easier for the body to carry it. Um, so yeah, so that's sort of what you see is with armor. It it fits you properly, and that's something that's really really important when it's getting made is fit. Because if you have an armor that slips or it moves or it does something that you don't want, then that could potentially completely screw you over in the battle. And we sometimes see these archaeological finds of cuirasses with very crudely riveted on extension plates on the sides. Perhaps they were given to a new owner who was slightly bigger, or perhaps someone overindulged over the Greek holiday season and needed to extend their armors. But yeah,
That's really funny, and I like the idea of, reusing armor and passing it down to someone is, who maybe is a little bit bigger. Even in the other case, maybe they're a little bit smaller, and you have to cut out pieces of the armor. I think that's quite uh, a comical thing, or not necessarily comical, but um, even something that we would still deal with today. Shortage of military supplies and whatnot. But yeah, so back to the armor and sort of how it's supposed to protect you. I think that's really interesting that we see the effectiveness of armor, right? So, obviously you don't want to take a direct blow to the abdomen with a spear. I mean, regardless of whether or not that punctures you, like you're still going to get probably some sort of blunt force trauma or at least some sort of bruising. I mean, you might not die, but you're not going to have like the best day. Probably going to have a little bit of a stomach ache after that. But, this sort of idea that armor is like, oh, we can just slash through armor isn't really a thing, right? So the warfare kind of evolved with that. Where are we aiming? Because I know in medieval sort of combat with full plate armor, you're aiming for the gaps, you're aiming for the underarms, the back of the legs, the areas that are exposed. And I think that's one of the things that hoplite armor is so good at is covering just a lot of different areas, but also maintaining that mobility and the ability to move quickly and efficiently.
and that's something that's really interesting is when you look at hoplites of the classical period where they don't have armor, they don't have thigh armor, people go, that's really poor armor. Instead of realizing that, for one, that's better armor than most of military history, but also you have to take into account shields, which are a massive thing. But also, which is what's really important to consider, is these aren't wars of mass annihilation, right? These are typically wars of fear more than anything else. It's basically untrained men who come to a battlefield. You're expected to hold that position, hold that line, face anything that comes up against you, and not run away. And predominantly, how almost every single one of these hoplite v hoplite battles ends is with one side running away. And that's when most of the casualties happen. So these actual casualty rates, these are your more aristocratic peoples. They're the people who are your working class. They're your farmers. They're your potters. They're your blacksmiths. You can't afford as a city to lose all of these people. So casualty rates seem to have been basically incredibly low for these periods. Most modern estimates put it at about 5 to 15%, which is quite small when you consider that. And another thing is as well is most people aren't stabbing full force all the time, which is what most weapons tests are, right? It's here's the piece of armor, broad, like right in the open, and here's my full body weight. Most stabs are a quick little thing like that over the shield to try and, you don't want to expose yourself, but also you tire incredibly quickly. It's an incredibly tiring thing to do to fight. And of course, if you get exhausted, then you're slow to react. There's all of these other things. So yeah, most of the time, armor doesn't have to protect you from a fully powerful stab. And even if it faced that, it would more almost certainly protect you. And even if it gets through slightly, that's the difference between you being fully impaled and you being cut, right? And that is the difference between like life or death. And that's something else when you see certain styles of armors. For instance, some tube and yoke style construction theories have shown that you can stab through them. It's like, yeah, well, I'd rather get stabbed with that than not. And that's another thing as well, is the same way, and I've likened this to modern bulletproof vests before, is we equip our law enforcement and our militaries with ballistics armors. Is that going to protect you against every single shot that it encounters? No, it isn't, unfortunately. Are you going to feel the shot? Yeah, lots of people get shot and they still go down, right? They get winded, their ribs break. But it stopped the bullet from actually killing you. But if you get shot with a sniper rifle, you're probably still going to die. So it's sort of like you see this, higher end like bronze armors, you're pretty much safe against everything unless you get incredibly unlucky. But even these sort of poorer armors that come in, it's not just this will protect me against everything. It's this will protect me more than if I'm not wearing it. And that's something else that we see as well. And again, we often disassociate ancient and modern armors, but again, remember that our modern soldiers are facing very similar pros and cons and areas of protection that ancient people were facing, and we are some of the least historically armored sort of soldiers that we see, right? We sometimes see arms and leg armor, but otherwise it's essentially, a vest and a helmet, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, the connection between, or the rather, the dichotomy between historical armor and modern day armor. And I think that also, the skewed perception, like you mentioned, that we have that thousands of people are dying. I mean, you have a village of maybe like what, 500 people, just making this up, but you have a village of 500 people and then you have like four blacksmiths. Well, if all your blacksmiths die, you have no one, that's a trade that takes a long time to learn. And, this is, like you said, it's not mass annihilation like we tend to see after the development of rifled firearms. Even in line battles before the Napoleonic Wars, I believe there was still some of that intimidation factor. And when people would charge, oftentimes the charges would result in people just running the other way because they didn't want to get impaled with a
Mhm.
triangular bayonet. That's just a very painful way to go, and there's no way to sew that. And then the casualty rates that we see in the Civil War and World War II and even the Vietnam War, those are things that are more on a modern industrial scale that we don't see in the periods of antiquity, simply for the fact that there's probably just not that many people fighting.
Well, also just these, as you sort of mentioned, the economies can't take it, right? So again, you
Yes.
have, and it's another reason why we're told that campaigns are so short is, well, I can't leave my farm for 3 days unattended, right? I need to harvest, I need to produce bread, I need to do this. So yeah, basically battles are, and I'd argue for most of history, are more of a mental battle of fighting fear than actually physically fighting someone. I mean, even have accounts of sections of armies, right, doing different things at the same time. So you have this idea that like the phalanx was this one continuous line of like a mass, snake basically that was controlled by sort of one figurehead, as opposed to we have instances where, in the middle of this army, this side's actually completely broken through and punched through the enemy phalanx, and then they just stop. They don't turn around and flank people. They've done their part. They've won their side of the battle. They're going to stop. They might do some looting. They might do something else. You have other sides where they might be hurling insults at one time as another side's fighting. We don't sort of see this mass uniform structure, and of course, these people don't want to die, right? So the same way that we have
No.
a lot of people today who'd say, "Oh, I'd react this or I'd do that," is very hard to actually do that when you're in that moment,
Yeah.
and that's why we actually see, which is interesting. Perhaps now would be a good time to sort of talk about Sparta. Is they often are coined as a military force. Now, what do you mean by military force? Because they're, again, not professional soldiers. Fundamentally, they are still a citizen militia force of aristocratic fighters. But what Xenophon specifically describes is a very basic drill of essentially follow the leader. So this is where Spartan military dominance, which did exist, again, there's people that then say the Spartans were not militarily successful at all. Blatantly incorrect. There was like 100 year span of time where basically every major land battle the Spartans were involved in that they won. So to say that the Spartans were not a military force is incorrect, but to say that they were a superhuman force that can never be beaten is also incorrect.
Yeah.
But we start to see this sort of notion of Spartan military supremacy emerging from just they were a slightly more structured and disciplined force of citizen soldiers. So they have a more uniquely structured command layout. So you have more officers per file. And literally, Xenophon describes it as being a game of follow the leader. That's how they would deploy, that's how they would move. And one of the most famous go-to Spartan tactics was essentially you'd march down and you'd swoop. And other sides who weren't as disciplined in that, they didn't have as many officers already that they could follow, would either break trying to counter that, or they'd get hit at a very awkward angle. And that's essentially Spartan military dominance. It's just they were slightly more efficient at maneuvering a phalanx or structuring their armies. And then once you start to change that up on them, you see them have catastrophic losses. So you see the Battle of Sphacteria, where they're essentially overwhelmed by loads of peltasts. And they actually say to the Athenians, come and fight us like men. And they go, nah. So the Athenians don't want to engage with them on a pitched hoplite battle because they know that they have a disadvantage in that instance. And you see the sort of most famous Spartan defeat being the Battle of Leuctra at the hands of Epaminondas. He completely changes the classical phalanx layout and the Spartans actually at first seem to be winning the battle until they're completely overwhelmed. So we sort of had this idea of the Spartans were very conservative in the sense that they didn't want phalanx warfare to change because they were the best at doing it the way that it was sort of traditionally. So it's interesting when you look at that yeah, most of these armies like Xenophon even describes that there was no need to train with the sword because it's merely an extension of your body. So that can tell you how they perceive sword fighting, right? It's just an instinctual thing of what you do. So actual weapons, martial arts skill isn't what's deemed important in this period. It is structure, holding a line, and being able to not falter basically when you're scared is typically how you would win or lose a battle is decided on morale.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You talk about this idea of warfare being sort of almost like a game. It sounds to me more like, it was like when I think of holding a line, I kind of think of football, holding American football, that is. Um, you're holding a line, the offense is trying to get the ball further down the field, and the defense is trying to prevent them from doing that, or the defense is trying to break through that line to, get to the quarterback or make them lose yardage or not progress further away. And I think that's a very interesting concept that we don't think of warfare today. I mean, obviously, warfare is a scary thing that no one would, would ever want to actually like experience, like the threat of being killed. But this is a different type of warfare that we see as opposed to modern warfare where we're, using guns and, just mowing down possibly lines of people or, just killing people that we can't even see. This is a very up close and personal sort of warfare. And
Yeah, very personal.
yeah, and we're seeing that um that style of warfare I've seen also in some videos of like I don't know if it's South Africa, I can't remember the exact place, but tribes in Africa and how they settle disputes is kind of almost like a game of back and forth where they kind of throw spears and then someone gets injured and then they like drag them away. It's this sort of and I'm not saying that's what hoplite warfare was, but I do think that there's this almost gamey element to it that is just kind of wild for our understanding of war in the modern day, especially when you're talking about hoplites, like groups of hoplites cheering or yelling insults at the other side while their buddies are down there fighting, but they're not in the same like group as them, so they don't have to engage in warfare or they're over here looting. That's just to me, that's just kind of a very foreign concept,
It's
especially when
really it's really weird for us to think of, especially when all of the sort of modern media adaptations of warfare that we see are, mass, always like Total War. You have blocks of armies that you sort of control through godly powers and they fight till the last man type thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to, and what's interesting is Thucydides would actually use the term parataxis to describe the phalanx, which I think is a better term. And my friend Paul Bordonius has outlined this before, and he's used the analogy of think of a phalanx as a string of beads, right, where each bead is sort of an individual group, as opposed to one solid line. And it is weird. It's just a different philosophy, right? Like you think I've pushed through my part, I've done my part. I'm not going to risk my life to do any more. And it is, I
Yeah.
think it's just really, we have this idea of mass annihilations, which did happen, right? Like we do have, like the Battle of 300 Champions is an
Oh yeah.
example of that.
Yeah.
But typically, most of these battles are relatively short, not particularly long, relatively low casualty rates, and yeah, again, more of a psychological battle of which side breaks first, and that basically always happened. One side basically always broke, and we even see the value of not breaking. So at the which battle was it? It's one of the Peloponnesian battles. Delium, the Battle of Delium. Socrates is fighting at Delium, and
Oh wow, I
his
didn't know. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I did not know that Socrates was actually a hoplite at one point. But that would make sense if he was a citizen, he would
yeah,
have had to have
he's an
served.
Athenian male citizen. So he's most of these philosophers and writers would have been at some point fought in their city's army, and he survives the battle after the Athenians flee. Him and a pack of them stay and hold their position, and the opposing hoplites don't want to mess with them, so they run around them, they avoid them. So it's like it's interesting how you can sort of see this really weird dynamic that is it's really hard for us to sort of conceive of how different warfare was to how we actually often perceive it as just being people brutally fighting and murdering each other until one side is dead by no one is left, as opposed to basically everyone runs away on one side, and then that's when most people die, is actually in that fleeing stage.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's almost like they had some sort of honor for them for standing their ground and saying, we're not going to attack you because you're being brave and honorable. It's a that I guess
Either
that's what it was.
either that or just if I try and fight you, there's a higher chance of me getting killed as opposed to the people running away, right? So there's also that side of it.
That is true. That is true. It's much easier to hit someone who's got their back turned to you rather than someone who's ready to take you on to the grave.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Now we were going to talk about Sparta as a military power, but right before that, I just had one question that I wanted to ask you
Yes.
that is unrelated specifically to Sparta. What is a trireme and how did they shape Greek warfare? And when do you first start to see the trireme appear?
So that's a great question. I'm not a naval historian at all, so bear with me here. So there's some debate about the origin of the trireme, whether it is actually of Greek origin or of Phoenician origin. Thucydides says that the Athenians got it from the Corinthians, and there's some debate whether the Corinthians got it from the Phoenicians. So I'm not sure the ins and outs of that debate or what side typically looks like they're winning. And they seem to come in around the 6th century, maybe a little bit before that, but I'd say probably around the 6th century BC. And they were a massively important aspect of Greek warfare. I mean, the Athenians basically had a naval empire built on the trireme. And of course, they had many catastrophic victories over the Persians utilizing the trireme as well. So the hoplite often gets a lot of focus in our modern eyes of being sort of the defenders of the foundations of Western civilization, but the trireme also played a massive role in that as well. But again, that's basically the intricacies of it. I haven't done copious amounts of research into naval warfare, although I have actually rowed the Olympias trireme in Greece, which was a very cool experience. And I was amazed at how well, relatively well, we were able to actually move that thing around. We didn't have a full deck. We had a load of amateurs who'd never rowed before, and we had actually we were able to develop a decent speed. Probably nowhere near the proficiency of actual professional Athenian oarsmen, which is actually something else I'll touch on, which is interesting. Hoplites didn't really get paid unless you were a mercenary. You were just a citizen body.
Oh,
But
wow.
Athenian seamen were professionals. So they actually got paid to man ships. And interestingly enough, we sometimes see that take a role in deciding whether Athens goes to war or not, is those of them who rode on ships needed some money, they might vote in favor of military action.
That's interesting that, hoplites weren't necessarily paid unless they were mercenaries. Now, these triremes, as you mentioned, they are man-powered boats. I assume still with rudders and sails, possibly, or no
Yeah,
sails.
so typically they would travel on sails and they would remove the masts and fight on rowing power.
Let's get on to everybody's favorite topic, Sparta. So, my first question for you is everybody's probably seen the movie 300. What is the agoge? Is this real? And what kind of things did people experience?
So the agoge, it's a later term. We actually don't know what the Spartans called their education system. It was probably just called the paideia, which was sort of the standard school term. It was a real practice. Now, how it was depicted in 300, as far as we can tell, is not very accurate at all to the classical or archaic Spartans. So the issue is a lot of our, and this is a very complex topic when it comes to Sparta, is a lot of our sources actually come from the Roman age after the reformer kings and a sort of big attempt at revivaling of reviving Sparta, and often they went a little bit more extreme than classical Sparta did. So when we actually look at the sort of archaic and classical sources of Spartan education, Xenophon is the one that gives us the most in-depth sources. He actually put his own children through the education system. And otherwise, we don't really know anything else. So, starting earlier, so around the time of Leonidas, we know that it was in place. We know that Leonidas went through it as a third-born prince, so he wasn't expected to become king. And we basically know that they were taken from the age of 7, put into an education system that was they were basically organized into groups and overlooked by an older Spartan citizen, essentially. They learnt various philosophies and mental models, I suppose you could say, like how to think like a Spartan, how to talk like a Spartan. Physical activity seems to have also come in to play, but otherwise that's basically all we can say. So there's no mention of any weapons training or anything like that. And this is sort of especially what Xenophon talks about um, is essentially an indoctrination into Spartan values, is what the education system is. So these were educated aristocrats, right? There's a state-issued education system, but this whole idea that they essentially lived in the barracks, never saw their parents, not true at all. In fact, we know that they went back to their homes probably every day. Reading and writing seems to have been something that was left up to a parental figure to teach. We're told, for example, that they were given I guess this sort of relates militarily. They're not necessarily trained in combat, but of course, synchronized dance is something. So we actually see this as one way that hoplites did train, which again they were essentially untrained soldiers, is through something called a Pyrrhic dance, which is a war dance. Now, anyone who's danced before or rehearsed any form of play or anything like that can sort of tell you how much you rely and build upon the rest of the people that you're doing that with. And it's also a very physically exhausting thing. So you've heard the term battle is like a dance, and there are actually quite a few
Yeah.
correlations in that. So the actual Pyrrhic dance, a war dance, was one of the ways that we seemingly see hoplites trained for battle. But otherwise, we have some mentions from Xenophon that around the early teens, maybe 12 years old, that physical activity gets introduced. So you would see different sports, but typically things like running, jumping, maybe boxing, javelin, things like that. Um, Team building exercises, competitiveness, things like that. We're also told, interestingly enough, that they were issued one cloak for all seasons. So it would mean that in the summer they may get too hot if they're in a cloak, but in the winter they might be too cold. They have to rely purely on one item of clothing. They're forced to go barefoot to build resilience to elements. So this is perhaps one of the most militaristic aspects of it. Is it's building um, building these young boys to be compliant with whatever conditions you may face on campaign, right? So being too cold, being too hot, being uncomfortable, essentially. We're told that they weren't given food during the Agoge, but we're also told that they would feast. So it's sort of this weird, like the thing of were they fed or were they not? It seems to be that like when they went home, they could be fed, or when they, did other things, they would steal food, they would hunt. Hunting was a really important thing, but maybe perhaps that their rations weren't very nutritious. So if they couldn't provide their own food, then they would go hungry, but otherwise they would be eating decently well. And in fact, Spartans seem to have been quite physically larger than other Greeks, which would indicate that they had good nutrition. So it's sort of this weird thing here of like, were they or were they not? We're told that, for instance, stealing for food was encouraged, but if you were caught, you were severely punished. So that's something that's interesting. And then there is this whole Krypteia idea of these boys being cast into the wild, which you see in 300. So this is a real thing, and it seems to go through three main phases, each change within each period. So again, Sparta is not a static state, right? This is something I guess I should have outlined in the start of this, is we have this idea of categorizing things as very unchanging, strict things like Sparta was this, Athens was this, as opposed to realizing that we're talking about, cultures that existed for hundreds of years. They changed a lot over these hundreds of years. I just think how much like our countries have changed since we've been living in them. Typically, modern societies and technologies change quicker, but it's a similar thing, right? Like we're still an ever-changing culture. And this is true for ancient cultures as well. So earlier on, the Crypteia seems to be a rite of passage thing where a select few boys are essentially cast out into the wild to survive and come back. By no means was this all of them. They didn't have to kill helots or anything like that. The second mention, and these are both by Plutarch, but the first mention that he gives is that they were essentially a militarized unit of scouts. So, like, the Crypteia were sent to scout around. And the third and latest mention is that they were used to spy and assassinate aspiring Helot revolters. So it's interesting, and this is again sort of touching on that whole Helot structure of how their treatment seems to change. Is they seem to start out, um, they had more freedoms than other slaves. For instance, Athens is interesting because they essentially had chattel slavery. They had a trans-sea slave trade. They would ship people in. They would sometimes castrate them so they couldn't reproduce. Like it was Athens often gets off scotch-free when it comes to their slavery, which is far more similar to the sort of later European slave trade, as opposed to the Spartan one, which is essentially a subsidized population that they conquered. And it seems to be that as Sparta gets later on, we see again around in the I think it's around 424, 426, there's a big earthquake anyway that sort of catastrophically impacts Sparta and it spikes Helot revolts. And it seems to be that around this period is when we suddenly see this massive sort of hammer being pushed down on Helots of the Crypteia being used to spy and assassinate ones that are aspiring to revolt, or every time a new Spartan government gets elected, they would annually declare war to, keep the numbers of Helots down, which is a barbaric and awful. The issue is that lens of Spartan Helot treatment is projected on all of Sparta, which doesn't seem to be the case. And Plutarch specifically mentions that when he does this source. And otherwise, that's basically it. All we have accounting for the Spartan education system is early childhood values of how to be Spartan and how to think, how to talk, which they had a very sort of laconic speech, which was quite interesting. Um, Sport and competition and things like that. And then there does seem to have been for certain boys this Creptair aspect of which took various forms. But that's essentially all we know about the Spartan education system.
Yeah, the cloak in particular and the going out in the wild is something that I particularly remember, and sometimes that like the boys were essentially had no clothing outside of this cloak and they had to sleep on it and do everything, and it was very rigorous. But like you said, our understanding might be changing a little because Spartans were typically taller, and usually people who are malnourished are shorter and have less stature. Same thing when you saw in early America, people were generally taller and healthier, had longer lifespans, and I think that's definitely an indication that although they were being put through this rigorous training, that it was some sort of like upbringing to make them good members of society. I guess almost you could think of it as like a because it doesn't sound as militaristic. I mean, there's obviously exercise and games, I'm sure, but sounds more like a Spartan summer camp to me for young
Yeah.
men.
Yeah, a little bit of an extreme one, but yeah, there's really no like in 300 you have this like them literally beating the crap out of each other or getting lashed until they cried out. That did happen, but that's a Roman age source. So like again, we sort of see lots of these, which again conveniently comes from Plutarch, and this is one of the biggest issues we look at Plutarch is he himself is writing in the first century AD. He sometimes talks about classical and archaic Sparta, but otherwise he's also often talking about his current Sparta. And typically, you can tell, usually he'll actually cite a source when he's talking about past Sparta, whereas he won't do that when he's talking about his Sparta because he's the witness. And the issue is that people don't realize that there's a 400-year gap and will say, well, Plutarch says this, therefore Sparta does that. As opposed to, of course, there's a 400-year, 500-year, 600-year, depending on what you're talking about, time span between those. Uh, but yeah, so for instance, we have like wrestling in the Temple of Artemis, I believe, for a thing of cheese was something that some of the Spartans would have done, as opposed to being the last one to cry out whilst getting whipped. So it sort of can show you the two different sort of styles of late or I guess early Roman age Sparta versus classical archaic Sparta. And Plutarch gets a lot of his sources from a man called Philaucus, who was living in the time of the great reformer kings. So his whole sort of lens on Sparta is problematic because it's potentially very skewed from this sort of once Sparta completely crumbled and tried to reignite its fame as a Roman tourist state, it became more extreme than it once was, essentially.
Yeah. So moving on from the Agoge, can we sort of talk about how was Spartan society structured? And, don't want to leave the ladies out of this. So what was it like being a Spartan citizen, and how would women have led different lives than men? And correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the women in Sparta had different rights or possibly a better life than some of the other city-states in Greece at the time.
Yeah, typically. So something that's interesting is that women had their sort of own agoge type thing. So they were also educated, but mainly physically. So the Spartans believed in basically if you had two physically fit parents, you would produce a physically fit child, which is kind of correct. You know, if you have human bodies which are in very good physical condition, you typically are less likely to have like birth defects and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So women were exercised. They were exercised in the nude as well, but boys and girls were typically split off. So basically, the idea is they would breed the desire for them when they would eventually marry. They would have very strong children bred with passion, essentially. So, but otherwise, yeah. So women are interesting in the sense that they can also inherit land in Sparta, which I believe as Aristotle attributes to being one of the downfalls of Sparta, as he says that basically the women have too much power over their men and that they inherited all the land, which is kind of a very Athenian lens, I think, towards this.
Yeah.
But the women in Sparta had a very interesting role. So they were typically the managers of the household. So they typically dealt with finances and actually managing the homestead, as opposed to Sparta itself was mainly, well, we use the term Sparta today. The term that we typically get historically is the Lacedaemonian. So the sort of whole region, Sparta is one sort of main city that loads of different areas. But essentially, Sparta had one of the largest territories in Greece. Basically, the whole southern Peloponnese, Messenia, and Laconia was under Spartan control. And when Sparta was founded, seems to have been of a Doric settler sort of influence. There was the Messenian Wars that took place, which is sort of what established Sparta as its as a military power early on. So they basically subjugated and conquered the neighboring region of Messenia, and they were basically told, get out or become a working underclass. So many of the Helots were essentially Messenians. And there are three main social classes in Sparta. So you have the homoioi, which means the similars, the equals, the Spartiates is sort of the modern term that we use. So they're the aristocratic Spartans that we think of when we say Sparta. So they went through the education system. They were the filthy rich guys, but they were very interesting. So they were very austere and had a very interesting social lens of, outlawing money for a stage. Money was deemed to breed greediness, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
They eventually did go to money, but it was outlawed for a time. They basically, Lycurgus was said to have split all the land in Sparta equally between all families. So every plot of land was roughly the same size, supposedly. The term similars. So even though there was some wealth disparity within the class, all of them were supposed to essentially dress the same and present themselves the same. We even have some sources that say that they were barred from wearing fancy clothes in Sparta, so they were wearing undyed clothing. So even though they were, yeah, and in one time, some of the wealthiest men in Greece, really, they had this weird sort of austereness to them of that they weren't really, um, like Athenian aristocrats, for example, you might see flexing their wealth a lot. The Spartans don't necessarily seem to do that. Now, militarily, they seem to whip out their battle dress and they have some really nice looking armors and stuff like that. But yeah, it seems to be that at home they're a little bit more austere. Then below them, you have the perioikoi, which are not citizens of Sparta, but they are sort of working around the main city in surrounding towns. They're your middle class. So they're typically your merchants and craftsmen, and then you have the helots below them, which are your enslaved class, or your working underclass, essentially. So the Spartans themselves were an aristocratic class. So they didn't really work. They spent a lot of time exercising together. Hunting was a big pastime, and they had communal dining halls that they'd go to every night. So they're an interesting class in the sense that we often think of the Spartans as very different to other Greeks. They're sort of similar to other Greek aristocrats, right? It's in lifestyle. So they seem to have dedicated some time to military practice of drill or just command structure from what Xenophon describes, but nothing serious. Again, they seem to have essentially have just been wealthy aristocratic hoplites, relatively similar to other states who did just have a slightly more structured command structure and organization of their army, which resulted in them just being slightly more effective on the battlefield. But only men were citizens, technically. So no women could run for office or vote, but they had heavy influence over their husbands. So even though they couldn't directly influence elections, whatever, like Spartan men were notorious for taking the words of advice from their wives. There's a famous quote where Gorgo says, "Because only Spartan women give birth to men," when she's basically asked, like, how do you have such control over your men from another woman? And she basically says that. Sparta's government's really interesting. So Sparta is a diarchy, which means it has two kings. We don't know entirely why that came about. There's a sort of founding myth that is, I believe it's Aristodemus is the hero that it stems from, is that he dies as his wife gives birth to twins, and they don't know which one's the eldest son to crown. And the wife basically, she knows which one it is, but she doesn't want to say. So they're like, okay, well, we'll consult the oracle, and the oracle's basically like, you'll have to crown them both as kings. So that's how the legend says that Sparta had two kings. Um, Possibly it was just there were two founding families of Sparta, but we don't really know. That's a mysterious but sort of uniquely Spartan thing. And they weren't absolute monarchs. So unlike in other cities where you had, tyrants and kings that had complete control, the Spartan kings were mainly they were high priests to Zeus. So they had to swear monthly oaths, and they were priests in the Temple of Zeus, and they also served as military commanders. And they served on the council of the elders, but they actually weren't the sort of head of state. They could be fined, they could be deposed, they could be exiled, which happens in certain occasions. And basically, the elders and the Gerousia, sort of the council, you can only serve one term as a councilman to try and prevent corruption, seemingly. And so essentially, probably every Spartan male served on the council at least once, just well, pretty much, which is interesting. And they would pass bills, they would pass votes. Something that's interesting is Athens is often credited with democracy, which is sort of correct. Most of our democracy comes from Athens, but actually Sparta had elements of democracy about 100 years before Athens did, and that was citizen assemblies based on voting. Now, what's interesting is how they vote. So Aristotle would actually use the term childish to describe it. Essentially, there would be one electorate who was locked in a room with a writing tablet, and as each policy or candidate or whatever was brought forward, he would record how loud the acclamation was for that, and whichever thing had the loudest cheer would be what the people voted for, which is interesting. Now, we're also told that if the audio wasn't easy to decipher, that they'd be moved and counted into groups. So maybe that would happen more likely. But we say that that's a really weird way of voting. But at the same time, if something's almost unanimous, it's probably pretty safe to figure out by sound. But anyways, that's an interesting side of Spartan government that we see.
Yeah, sounds like they were just doing that as a way to kind of get around having to count a couple hundred votes. Like,
Yeah.
it seems like everybody's in favor of this. Cheer. Oh, okay, yeah, we'll do that. Sweet. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think what's also interesting about what you said about Sparta is that it's really just we think of Sparta as like this big war state, but in reality, it's probably a small group of people who are actually considered Spartans because it's a social elite.
Yes, yeah,
And then
yeah.
everybody else who's working around Sparta are not really considered Lacedaemonians, correct?
Yeah, so well, yeah, maybe they would be considered Lacedaemonians, but they wouldn't be considered the Homoioi, essentially.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
the ruling class of, I see.
Yeah, essentially like that. So, and one thing that's interesting is actually when you compare it to Athens, I believe Athens had around a 30 to 40,000 population at the height of its power, which is pretty big for an ancient city. But of course, the only people who were citizens in Athens were wealthy land-owning Athenian-born males. So when you actually take into account the numbers of citizens or voters in Sparta and Athens, the numbers are probably pretty similar, but yet we think of Athens being far more democratic. But actually, the vast majority of people who lived in Athens had no say at all politically. So immigrants would have no say at all. No women would have any say. Poor Athenian men wouldn't. So most people in these cities, we think that they're democratic, whereas it is really the ruling elites that really have any say. Um, but yes, that's sort of a crash course on Spartan sort of structure. So it is a really interesting, and something that's interesting as well is it's often just completely devoid in our modern lens of any cultural, artistic, anything like that. But early Laconic art is some of the most beautiful in Greece and is actually renowned as some of the best in Greece. So we see these early Laconic artworks that's really beautiful art that takes place. And instead, sort of those more intricacies of Sparta get foreshadowed by the sort of warrior mirage that they themselves build as well. They're sort of a victim of their own press in a way.
Yeah.
But of course, in modern times, that has been blasted way out of proportion in some cases. But yeah, Sparta overall is a really, really fascinating culture that people often again oversimplify, and one of Sparta's main problems that it's been politically torn apart by various political bodies, and of course that's something that's frustrating is when you have politics infiltrates a historical culture because it's not really our job as modern people to deem whether a historical culture was good or bad. Or for instance, during like the Cold War, many historians used Sparta as proto-communist and Athens as proto democracy. So lots of people took anti-Spartan lenses in that instance or whatever. So it's sort of been and it's historically been so as well, but politically torn apart. As opposed to as well, something that we have to consider is we're modern people who have a specific cultural and societal lens that we view the world. We have morals that we were raised with. That when you go back in time, someone could be morally good for their period, and to us not be a morally good person, but their whole societal makeup doesn't deem, for instance, slavery as bad in this period, right? Pretty much everyone's engaging with slavery, so someone views them as a tool as opposed to a human being. So it's sort of an interesting thought experiment, I guess, to think of is what we today deem as what's good and what's bad, or what's societally acceptable and what's societally not. For these ancient people that we're judging who lived 2,500 years ago, they weren't raised with those same ethical platforms, I guess. They're not playing the same rules to the game that we might think of.
Yeah, it seems like Sparta almost gets overshadowed by Athens in terms of their actual, artistic and I guess ideology, their prowess in those sort of areas. They just are kind of deemed as a warrior culture, almost in a negative connotation, when in reality they were a very complex society and contributed to possibly some of the ideas that we still use today. And
Something,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And something that's really interesting. This is one of the reasons why I prefer earlier Sparta. It's one of my main interests. Is like for instance, the Spartan citizen body were a massive role model for other Greek city-states in the foundings of their polis. Like Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, he was like looked upon with admiration from lots of these other aristocratic states. Or Kelon of Sparta, who was one of the seven sages of ancient Greece, a very famous philosopher. He was massively important as well. So we have all of these things. Like Sparta actually had a massive developmental power and influence on other Greek states that often gets completely ignored in exchange for its militaristic side, which is arguably way less interesting than the other side of it, at least in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, it's a constant back and forth and everything like that. And again, it's a very, very complicated society that changes just like every single society. But yes, overall, I think Sparta often gets too simplified and too generalized, and people sort of pick it apart for specific things when they can't necessarily do that in a fair way, if that makes sense.
100%. And I think this is actually another subject that we could talk about in a later episode, especially the uh, rise of Sparta as a military power and also what caused its downfall and sort of an anthology of, what is Sparta. I think that would definitely be an interesting topic for us to delve into. But I wanted to ask you one more thing about Sparta before we move on to sort of clearing up some misconceptions about Greek uh, hoplites in Greek society in general at this time. So Leonidas, or everybody, anybody who knows anything about Greek history or Sparta has probably heard of Leonidas, the more proper way to say it. What did he look like? Up to the Battle of Thermopylae, how old was he? Do we have any information on his early life? What he looked like? What he might have worn at the battle?
So, Leonidas is a really interesting figure because he basically is only famous for the Battle of Thermopylae. He came to power very, very late. He came to power at around 50 years old because he was a third born and a twin of the uh, Aegead bloodline. So his older brother was likely Cleomenes, I believe is his name. Um, Young Leonidas probably just fought under his campaigns for most of it. We really don't hear anything about what Leonidas is doing until his rise to fame in Herodotus. We know that he went through the Agoge because he was a third-born son who should not have essentially come to power because he had two old siblings. His middle brother ended up going mad and basically he left Sparta to try and find his found his own colony and he died. And then Leonidas is there. Oh, that's interesting. Now I'm king. So he seems to rise up. Yeah, about 50 something years old, he becomes king. And he doesn't really do anything famous or remarkable or notable in his kingship, except for this Battle of Thermopylae, which of course has made him the most legendary Spartan figure of all time. He was about 60 years old when he went to the Battle of Thermopylae, which is really interesting. So, what did he look like? We don't know at all. We have no description of him. We have no confirmed artistic depictions. There's one statue who's often nicknamed the Leonidas statue that was found on the Spartan Acropolis, but no evidence to suggest that that was necessarily Leonidas. In fact, there's other similar statues that exist in other parts of Greece, which has made some believe that it's actually a religious deity. So, he was slightly old. He was 60 years old. He was very close to retiring from military service at that time. So what did he look like? We can't really say, unfortunately. Armor, what did he wear armor-wise? Well, this I guess we can make some educated guesses on. He was obviously very wealthy, so he was likely equipped fully in bronze. So he was probably wearing a bell cuirass or an early transitional cuirass, especially to consider that he's an older person, so he might well be wearing, older armor unless he's commissioned recently really new stuff, which he probably isn't doing at age 60. Helmets, Corinthian helmets, again, very popular in that period and very commonly depicted in Spartan artwork, but other things like Illyrian helmets he could quite possibly have worn, almost certainly would have worn greaves. Now, did Leonidas fight with the full archaic armament? It's possible. He was certainly serving in the army in a time where that armor was still in use. But otherwise, we don't really know what he was wearing, unfortunately. He would have just been dressed really by other aristocratic hoplite levels of armament. So, likely full bronze, helmet, shield, spear, sword, things like that. Um, so yeah, his early life, really know nothing about, unfortunately, except for he probably served in the campaigns of his older brother. And he married his niece, Gorgo, which is interesting. We might think, what the heck? But again, these sort of royal families intermarrying to somewhat related people is very common historically. It shares the wealth and everything like that within those families. So she's quite a lot younger than him. And Gorgo's a really interesting figure because she's like immediately recognized as a very free-thinking, intelligent person in various other things. Like she even advises her father not to basically get scammed by something. So she's a very, very interesting figure. And there is a theory that isn't really based on much evidence that actually Leonidas and Gorgo conspired to kill the king who previously went insane. So their family member who previously went insane because he was insane and locked up in jail. Basically, Gorgo could get oh, and he committed suicide in the jail. Basically, historically, and that's how Leonidas became king. So there's a theory of, well, how did he kill himself in the jail cell? So there is a theory, which is kind of fun to think about again. There's not really much evidence at all that concretely makes this a fact or likely to happen, but that essentially Laelius and Gorgo got together because they wanted to become the king and queen, and because she could have access to her father in prison, basically snuck him a knife and he killed himself because he was insane. And then that made Laelius become king. But again, no real concrete evidence. That is just sort of an interesting lens to take to it, that maybe it was sort of orchestrated, or it could just be that literally was just a very unlikely third born who happened to become Spartan king. And then yeah, so he fights at Thermopylae. He dies at Thermopylae. The Greek force is overrun at Thermopylae. He's essentially famous for losing a battle, but of course there's a lot um, of morality and myth and legend that sparked from that battle. The Spartans managed to very strategically spin that into this. See, the Spartans were willing to go further than everyone else and lay down their lives for all of this, as opposed to in reality, it could quite possibly have just been a military action that went catastrophically wrong. Interesting to talk about again, probably too in depth to talk about just for this section. And something that is interesting as well is he was raised differently to other kings. So I mentioned he went through the Agoge, which is one of the reasons why we know the Agoge was in place in this time, whereas other Spartan kings were privately tutored. And this could have very dramatically have changed the way that he commands, right? So as opposed to other Spartans are trained to be law-abiding followers or order followers. Kings were taught to be leaders. So Leonidas was never taught how to be a leader. So this could give us a little bit of insight, and Rourke and Idike, he was talking about this before. Basically, there's a theory of Leonidas' personality-wise that when he's told that the Spartans are overrun, he doesn't really know what to do as a king because he's never really had to lead campaigns before. So he
Uh,
stays because he was originally ordered to stay at Thermopylae. So he goes, I don't really know what to do as a king, but I know what to do as a Spartan, and that's to follow orders. So there's that sort of theory that maybe that could be a little bit of insight into Leonidas, that he was purely just like, no, I was told to stay here, that's what I'm going to do. I don't know what else, I don't know how to take lead in this situation. But it's all just really speculation and theory based on the very small amount of information that we're given on Leonidas. We essentially judge him based on his actions at Thermopylae. That's basically everything we have on him as a historical figure.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about some misconceptions about Greek and hoplite culture and things like that. So, what are some of like the biggest misconceptions that you see with those things? Because when I think of, how the hoplites are portrayed in media, like, 300 or my one of my favorite games, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, these are I believe that Odyssey has quite a decent amount of good portrayals, but there's also some things that are a little bit fantastical there, or even just in general, what we might have learned in school that we should now be challenging. Are there any sort of big overarching ideas that maybe aren't necessarily true?
I think there's actually quite a lot, and there's different lenses that you can take this. There's of course the visual component, such as obviously 300's depiction of Spartans isn't accurate, right? And
Yeah.
for me, I'm a big critiquer of historical things. I actually really enjoy the movie. I think it's great, but I view it as a comic book action flick. I don't view it as a historical film. So I think I'm a lot more lenient on 300, and I think people probably think that I am on. Um, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I also really enjoyed that game. I think my biggest annoyance with that game was that you couldn't use a shield. I was like, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
Um, so that was, but overall, I thought they did a great job of, especially recreating the world of ancient Greece. I thought they did a really, really great way, really, really great doing that. Um, Armament wise, I mean, there's always that. I'll use Christopher Nolan's Odyssey as an example. I really don't like the 21st century lens of historical people that it was dark, gloomy, no color, depressing, dirty. I really don't like that, and I think it's a real shame that we often depict historical people like that. Because when you actually look at the world today, we're arguably one of the most monochrome civilizations in all of history. We
Yeah.
paint our houses with white walls and we like minimalist furniture. We typically drive black or white or silver cars. Our modern lamp posts are just pure efficiency. There's none of this fanciness on it. Modern buildings are concrete or glass blocks. So I think it is interesting that we often depict historical cultures who actually were typically a lot more vibrant and bright and over decorated as being sort of under advanced, crude people who were stupid. I think that's one of the biggest things that I hate the most, and that can sort of be applied to all historical periods. Is just we have this idea that um, we are better in every way to hit people of the past. And we almost separate ourselves from people of the past. And we almost view like here's history and here's us instead of like here's the history timeline, here's us right now, but eventually we're also going to be history. And I think that that's interesting. We almost separate ourselves from historical people as opposed to, of course, like the people in archaic Greece didn't view themselves as archaic Greeks, they viewed themselves as the present. So I think that's one of the biggest things, one of the biggest mindset changes that anyone can make to try and understand the past better is understanding that just like you and me, these people pretty much are exactly the same as us, right? And that we are also history. We're just currently at the most recent part. Um, but otherwise, there's other misconceptions. You definitely have Spartans were insane super soldier warriors. Equally, now you have the whole Spartan Mirage gang that likes to present the Spartans as nothing out of the ordinary, which is also not correct. You have that sort of side of it. God, what else? I think the Persians often get the short end of the stick. They're an interesting historical culture that, again, it's not really our place to judge, I don't think, as modern people. They often just get presented as barbarian invaders instead of they were actually a very interesting empire that was incredibly ahead of its time in some cases, also incredibly militaristically advanced as well. That often gets thrown out of the window as like, oh, the hoplites beat back all of the badly trained and badly equipped slave army of the Persians, and have risen up. The Persians actually had a really, really competent army. It's how they conquered so much. Um, but gosh, things like that, Spartan babies getting thrown off of cliffs, that's a big misconception that has no archaeological evidence supporting and basically no literary evidence supporting that. I could probably sit here for a very long time and pick apart, but I think if I were to pick an overall nice moral of the story is view historical people the same way that you view us. Like we generalize a lot because we have to generalize, but the same way that you would say like societally this is correct. Think today how societally people disagree, right? Like there's a lot of different like we don't all think one way on every topic. And something else that's interesting is we often think of like Plato and Aristotle, all these philosophers, Socrates. as opposed to realizing that lots of people really didn't like what they were saying and disagreed with them, right? So it's sort of an interesting thing that we often think of, and it's really hard for us to comprehend how much time passes. We're people who live, if we're lucky, 80 years. We're talking about hundreds of years, thousands of years of history. It's pretty much impossible for us to comprehend that much time. And I think that's something that, we sort of have to generalize, and, we like to use broad terms and everything like that, but there are limits to that. And I think that's sort of one of the things that I love so much about experimental archaeology and reenactment and living history is not perfect, but it's, in my opinion, the closest we can really ever get to time travel. There's that saying, you can never really know a man until you walk a mile in his shoes. I think that's really, really true from the shoes that you wear. It's a different feel. The way that we walk as modern people is actually different to how most people walked historically. The landing on the ankle and pushing to the toe is a pretty much a new way of walking. So that's sort of interesting. You have to change the way that you actually do things to fit in with how historical equipment is designed. The food that they ate, some of the most mouth-watering dishes I ever had have been cooked by John, who's a member of our group, who's done like copious amounts of research into food, and he's produced these gorgeously delicious period foods. That's awesome. Sleeping on minimum stuff, like a sheepskin, some wool blankets and stuff like that. It's a really humbling experience, and that's one of the things that I love about it is, you know, there's so many things that we take for granted today, like a bed or a hot shower. That like all of these people that we admire historically didn't, well, beds were, but like things like hot showers. I think Jimmy Carr's even talked about this in one of his things. Like no one that you admire historically had the simple life pleasure of simply turning on a hot shower. So that's one of the things that I sort of love about that sort of, even if it's just for a weekend or a week, that complete separation from the hectic modern world and everything like that. And it is really a humbling experience and give you so much insight into how people of the past used to live. And that's just something that I really, really love. I think that's sort of invaluable, really. It's an experience that you don't really get until you do it.
Yeah, 100%. And having done a little bit of that myself and actually trying to, go and do more of that, I completely understand what you mean. It's an experience unlike any other. And I think that, yeah, like you touched on there really well that, we think of them as dirty or uneducated, when in reality they did not have the same processed foods that we have today. So they
Big one.
didn't, yeah, they did not need to, the Greeks were pretty good with hygiene. They were able to brush their teeth pretty minimal supplies, but they still did it in a way that, kept their breath smelling fresh, kept, them from really developing any sort of issues, I guess, to the extent that we would see with like cavities and things today. Not to say
Yeah.
that they were perfect and they probably had a different standard of hygiene than we have today, but they still were people who wanted to smell good and look good. And, that's one of the things about the Greeks in general is that they look cool. They look good. They don't look,
Yeah.
you don't really see depictions of dirty, disgusting people. Like they have really nice hairdos. They work out, they look good, they take care of themselves, they eat well, relatively. But, I think that you touched on all of that really well there. And I think another thing, which actually leads me into our second to last discussion topic, is experimental archaeology and trying to live the things that people did at that time and see how that sort of worked out for them. Like what works, what doesn't, what we have learned from how they lived and maybe why they did things. So this idea of experimental or practical archaeology, we'll call it, why do you think this is important? And do you think what do you think it's better at as opposed to like traditional archaeology? And what are some things you think maybe traditional archaeology is better at that experimental archaeology?
So that is a great question. So, physical archaeology is typically the study and unearthing of physical artifacts and objects, which are it's a super valuable source of information. Of course, archaeological evidence is one of the main things that we base everything on. It's really, really important. When we say experimental archaeology, it's not really archaeology in the sense that we are discovering things that were physically exist in the historical period. It's essentially that we are, recreating to as accurate as we can the armors, the lifestyle, the clothing, the foods, all of these conditions that you can really only experience by doing. And it's such a valuable source. No, for instance, the scholarly approach to history is absolutely spectacular. It's awesome. Scholars are great. They can give a wealth of information, but there are some things that scholarly approach lacks, and that's something where the experimental archaeology or the reenacting. There's sort of different terms that sort of broadly overlap and sometimes don't in different groups. So I'll just call it the experimental archaeology or the living history sort of community does is, for instance, you might have scholars that are really only interested in arguing within scholarly thought, and they might both be incorrect. And my friend Paul Bordonius is sort of a prime example of this. He's actually a biologist by trade, but he's a multi-published author on ancient Greek warfare and works. He's worked at Harvard for history things. He's sort of him and Roll have worked together a lot as well. So he's done a lot of stuff, and he's basically gone like, no, both of these academic camps are wrong, and I'll show you. And I'll get 200 guys together and we'll physically test that what you're saying is possible or what you're saying isn't possible. And it's great to see because I sort of love it because we'll just go like, no, no, I'll show you, and then he'll do it, or he
Yeah.
won't do it. And it's a really valuable, and I think, and unfortunately, there's some scholars who seem to absolutely despise the sort of living historical community and think that we're a lot of amateurs who like to play dress up, which is absolutely correct. But there is also
Yes.
a great learning opportunity that only that sort of lens can give you. What is it like to wear armor and move in this and fight like this? Well, you can theorize about it, but I've had people telling me before that like you can't do this in hoplite armor. Yes, you can. Or, like how did a phalanx work? Well, we don't really know, but we can say that through practical experience, whilst gathering, 100 people with accurate kit or as accurate as we can, doing this works better. Or doing this, I think, makes this theory more likely. We don't really work with categorical truth claims and false claims. There are some things that you can basically do that. But it is a great way, and I think experimental archaeology and the scholarly approach to history working together is the strongest. Um, as opposed to sometimes the scholars get too wrapped up in debating other scholarly thoughts that could both be incorrect. And the practical lens is so valuable in the sense that it's the closest that we can get to actually experiencing those historical things. And we could go as experimental archaeology as literal as I have recreated a shield based on the Vatican Museum find, and we have tested against arrows and spears to actually see how these archaeological things would have held up historically. It can give us a lot of insight into warfare. We've done the same with armor, things like that. But it's just a really, really valuable, and again, I said sort of humbling. I think it is the closest sort of to time travel. It give you a lot of really valuable and in-depth viewpoints into historical things. And sometimes living history, reenactment, or whatever you want to call it, gets sort of lumped in with LARPing or cosplay. And they are completely different things. And that's, not to shame one thing over the other, but when, I've sort of talked to my girlfriend about this actually before, because she was basically saying that it's a costume. Like, well, definitionally, I would say yes, it probably does count as a costume. But I would say the way that societally we talk about these things, it doesn't really count as a costume. Like, when you look at a cosplayer, they're going through a lot of research to typically recreate a fictional character. But they're using polyurethane, they're using foam, they're using all these things to make a costume that looks good. What we're attempting to do is go back to the basics. How accurate can we possibly basically recreate things that once existed and were once used to try and be as accurate as we can to portray the people of the past? And though fundamentally they're similar, you're creating something to dress in. The purpose and the outcome is very different. And I think that that's something again, like some of the impressions that we have in our group, they're like museum level replica quality, right? Like that's the type of thing that you could see, like as close as we possibly can replicate from historical artifacts. And there's something that is really, really valuable about that. And Paul is a great example. The amount of work that he himself has done, like with the work of others, but Paul predominantly orchestrating all of these things to predominantly talk about warfare. It's like, yeah, you can run and stay in line. Here we go, I've got together a load of reenactors and we've demonstrated that. Or this is the spacing that we've found works the best, as opposed to, for instance, some scholars say that you have to stay 3 foot separated so that the spearman can function properly. Okay, well, let's test it. Let's get a group of HEMA people together and have one row standing with 3 feet apart. You have another row standing, shields touching, and it shows that this overwhelmingly destroys this every time. It's things like that that can be really, really valuable. Whereas the scholarly theory is great, but it has its limitations. The same way that the practical experimentation has its limits, but it has its strengths as well. And both of them together are a really powerful force of understanding and studying the past.
Yeah, yeah, I really appreciate you kind of explaining, how the two work together because like you said, I think that a lot of times one will tend to give the other a bad rep, but in reality, they should be working together. Now, before we wrap up here, I just have a couple more questions about what you plan to do with your channel and maybe also in your personal life. Do you have any plans for your YouTube or social media that you would like to share with us?
Ooh, that's a great question. I am excitedly working on some articles for Ancient Warfare magazine, actually with Paul Bardonius. So that's something I'm excited for. And it's on archaic warfare. So I'm excited about that. I'm not going to share too much because I want to hype up the anticipation. So that's something I'm excited about that we'll be working on very, very soon. Um, the channel, what's going to come next? I'm going to continue obviously doing all of the ancient Greek stuff, but as I expand into the medieval stuff, I'm going to do some. I'm very particular in what I talk about in the sense that I don't like talking about things I'm not very well versed in.
Yeah.
And I've been involved in the hoplite stuff for over a decade, even though I started when I was very young, but I've been heavily involved in that for a very, very long time. Whereas medieval stuff, I know there's still a lot to learn for that, and there's more to learn. So I'm going to do a few videos on medieval stuff, but predominantly comparing like why is medieval armor different to ancient Greek armor, that type of stuff. So I'm excited to do that. And otherwise, yeah, I mean, what we just hit 50K, so what is 100K the next goal? Maybe we can get there. That would be kind of crazy. I have a few YouTube collaborations that have been in the long time discussions that I'm hopefully going to be able to get done this coming year. And yeah, what else? That's probably about it, really. Um, Starting a new impression in the medieval period, which
Oh,
is exciting. Basically, starting from the basics again, which I haven't done for a
yeah.
very, very long time. So that's always fun.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Yeah, I think you can definitely hit 100K. I look forward to it and I fully support you in that.
Thank you
And
so much.
yeah, of course. And I wanted to ask you next, do you have any personal goals that you want to plan maybe or that you plan that you would like to share?
I think the main thing is honestly just writing the and publishing these articles. I think that would be really cool to say. It's specifically a published author on archaic arms and armor. I think gives a little bit of credit of more sort of credibility, I guess, to my YouTube channel, which is great. Um, but yeah, I guess that's sort of the main thing that I'm really excited about it is the writing side.
I see, that makes sense. Now, I always like to end with this. What is one piece of advice that you would like to give for anyone who is looking to get into this form of archaeology or reenacting or just history in general?
My gosh. I would say, don't be afraid to reach out. You can reach out to me, get involved in the international communities, join the international hotplate discussion group, get in contact with groups that are close to you. All of these people, like I'm only one voice, right? There's a lot of people that have other voices, a lot of wealth of information and advice out there, and everyone is so willing to help. And it can be a really intimidating process to get started in this recreational sort of historical community. And there's really a lot of help out there. So, don't be too turned off by it. Don't be rushed by it. Um, Take your time, do it right. Don't rush into it all, and definitely use the resources that are available to you. Whether that's other people doing your own research, reaching out to people specifically. Like I get messages all the time from people who watch my channel on Instagram about things, and I happily talk back to you guys. So definitely, that would be my main advice: is just you're not alone. and make sure that you use those resources around you because there's a lot of people who are not a lot more than me as well, right? And I still go to them for advice or talk about things and stuff like that. And I think that's really how, there's no point in going through it alone because there's so many people that can help you do that.
Yeah, of course. And I can speak to that, starting my own hoplite impression. A lot of the people, including yourself in the IHOP, as it's called, International Hoplite Discussion Group, are very helpful, very insightful, and provide a lot of great resources. So yeah, I think that's some great advice. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Adam. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that I get to have you on again in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a great time. I'd be more than happy to come on again in the future. And of course, sorry, the best piece of advice I could ever give someone is, of course, go and subscribe to the Leonidas Sparta YouTube channel and watch
Yes,
all of the videos that are 2 years or younger.
that's a wonderful. Yes, 2 years or younger, not anything
Yes.
from.
Yeah, don't go back. Don't keep scrolling. No.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.